Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 9, The Baker's Dozen episode. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
We have something very special for the people today. Part 1 of a 2-part interview with Lauren Sherman and Chantal Fernandez, 2 of the top, most respected fashion and retail journalists, talking about their best-selling book, Selling Sexy, Victoria's Secret and the Unraveling of an American Icon. Steve, you and I both had the same thought at the end of our interview with Lauren and Chantal. Too much great content to squeeze into a single episode of the pod.
Yeah, it's really great conversation, and we definitely could have gone longer because there's so much in this book. As I mentioned in the interview, I love that it is both the story of an American icon, and it's quite an interesting story, as our listeners will hear, but there's also just a lot of good context for how retail has evolved. So I think there's a lot to unpack. And we've got to split into 2 episodes. And it's also fun to get both of them on the mic. I've known Lauren for many, many, many years, Chantal a little bit less, but they're just great journalists and great observers of what's going on in retail.
Before we get to part 1 of our interview with Lauren and Chantal, by the way, part 2 will be this coming Friday. So we're going to do a Friday episode. So keep your eyes and ears open for that. Before we get to that interview on their best-selling book, Selling Sexy, let's dive into this week's most important retail news, brought to you by Scale, the world's fastest-growing enterprise commerce platform. Learn more about the solutions at scale.com. That's SCAYLE.com. All right, well, let's start with this Trump tariff stuff, this 25% solution. As you can imagine, it's roiling lots of stuff up here in Canada as Trump posts on social media that he wanted to charge a 25% tariff on goods coming from Canada and Mexico, which I believe are your America's 2 top trading partners, and another 10% more on China. So I know how this is landing here. How's it landing on your side of the border?
Well, as we talked about last week, this whole tariff story is likely to be in the news for a while. I didn't necessarily expect we would be back to it in just a week, but yes, Trump did decide to share a bit more about what he's thinking, and it's certainly gotten a lot of attention here, a lot of attention from retailers as well, because if some or all of this were to come to pass, it would be quite significant to retail and the economy more broadly. So as you mentioned, Mexico and Canada are big U.S. trading partners, and you can understand why Mexico and Canada are quite concerned about it, because the U.S. gets 83% of Mexico's exports and about 75% of Canada's, and that's across a pretty wide spectrum of goods, appliances, auto, as well as more consumable things like avocados. So there's quite a lot of discussion about how real this threat is, or whether it's really just negotiating leverage or ultimately somewhere in between. Part of Trump's announcement was basically demanding that there would be more border controls, not only for undocumented workers coming across the border, but also trying to control fentanyl and trafficking and those kinds of things. Just as a fun fact, not to say that there aren't opportunities to lock down the border to keep illegal drugs coming from across, but the vast majority of fentanyl actually comes into the country through airports, not across the borders. And most of it is actually, what's the term, muled, I guess, by U.S. citizens, not immigrants. So that's a little bit of a dog whistle, I think. But yeah, we'll see how this transpires. The stock market kind of took it in stride, but I think from a retail perspective, as we talked about last week, if some or all of these tariffs were come to pass, that would be quite inflationary. And in the case of many categories of goods, it's not easy for the U.S. to start to pick up production. I mean, it's not like you can throw up an appliance plant or an auto plant in a couple of months' time. So we'll see. One other little quick thing I wanted to hit on is that some folks have, as part of the commentary, been able to say, well, there were a bunch of tariffs that were put into place in 2018, and that wasn't a disaster for the economy. But it's important to mention that none of the tariffs in 2018 actually impacted consumer goods. So again, this could be quite significant to consumers in terms of higher prices, and quite significant to retailers in terms of how it would either squeeze their margins or just put a monkey wrench into their plans. But certainly retailers' contingency plans are kind of in overdrive as they try to figure out what's going to go on. Consumers, if you want to buy a car or washer and dryer or furniture, you might want to do it in the next little bit.
It's a pretty good time to buy those things for sure. I mean, on this side of the border, we've learned through experience to take pronouncements like this with your biggest trading partners seriously, but perhaps not literally in the case of Trump. But the impact on the Canadian dollar was immediate but short-lived. To your point about the stock market, we dropped Canadian dollar versus U.S. dropped like 1% overnight, but then it's kind of recovered back to where it was. And as you say, the retailers I spoke to here are just in contingency overdrive planning because, if these things happen, you worry about a 69-cent dollar. Of course, we buy a lot of our goods in U.S. dollars, even if they're not made in the U.S. and a consumer recession, which could, because 78% of the stuff we export goes to America. So anyway, lots of dynamic.
Good times.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's talk about earnings. There's a ton of earnings. Actually, it's funny. Last week was Black Friday week. Of course, the Cyber 5 just behind us, or just in the rearview mirrors as our listeners are listening to this. But boy, so much retail news. Where do we start? Let's start with Macy's.
Well, yeah, Macy's was more than just an earnings announcement. And yeah, you're right. Actually, when I was going through earnings, I originally started with a list of about 10 companies, and we will spare the listeners going through all of that. But we do have a few that I think are worth mentioning.
Part 7 coming up on the next week. Part 7 of the podcast coming up.
But yeah, starting with Macy's. Well, Macy's didn't exactly release earnings because, as I'm sure many people have heard by now, they have a bit of a debacle going on. The company identified that a single employee who has since been terminated, who is an accountant that oversaw small package delivery expense accounting, made erroneous accounting entries to hide, apparently, to an attempt
intentionally,
to hide,
right?
Intentionally. Well, as far as we can tell, intentionally to hide about $150 million of delivery expenses since the fourth quarter of 2021. So this has been going on for 3 years. And Macy's did not release their earnings because they are completing their investigation and presumably will be doing a restatement of all their quarterly earnings since this time to reflect the more accurate accountings. Now, this is quite extraordinary to have such a large. Well,
where's the fraud here? I'm trying to figure out what the game is by hiding these things from an individual intent. Like the word intentionally just stands out like, an error.
Well, it's a bit hard to really work out the motivation here because it doesn't seem like an accountant would have a ton of incentive to do this other than perhaps to affect their bonus, to make their boss look good or something. So two things really. One is it's hard for me to imagine that this kind of misstatement could go on for so long without it being detected. So it definitely speaks to some issues around financial controls at Macy's. Certainly wouldn't surprise me to see some other heads roll once they complete their full investigation. But yeah, I can't quite work out why a relatively junior person who presumably does not have a lot of money on the line to misstate things would do this, but perhaps we'll learn more about it.
Yep.
But in terms of it being material, this amount, even though it's a big sounding number to miss for 3 years, it's only about 3% of their delivery expense.
Yeah.
And it's certainly minor compared to the overall expense structure at Macy's, but it's not a great look for Tony Spring, who's just about to transition to his second year of turnaround efforts as the CEO. The restated earnings will come in a couple of weeks. Macy's did report some preliminary results in terms of sales, and they weren't great, but a little bit of encouragement has been the case the last couple of quarters. Macy's so-called first 50 locations, so these are 50 stores where they've done some enhanced strategic changes. For another quarter, they did have some comparable sales growth, up nearly 2%, so not amazing, but positive, particularly when you compare that to the rest of the chain, where overall comparable sales were down 3%. We did see a little bit of positive momentum with Bloomingdale's, which had a small comp increase, as well as Blue Mercury, their beauty business, quite small to the total, but those sales were up 3.3%. But we'll see where earnings come out. My guess is they'll be in the break-even area, but we'll have that in a couple weeks.
let's talk about Kohl's. I mean, it almost feels like they wish they had a rogue accountant at Kohl's. Like the numbers are so bad, they got nothing to blame it on. What a terrible quarter.
Yeah, another terrible quarter, like really, really a train wreck is the way I would describe it. Their comp sales were down over 9%. This marks the 11th straight quarter of negative same-store sales. Just
It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to be down 9%, actually. Like that's a lot of work to get.
Yes, and the other thing, and I think we've touched on this over the last couple of years because it's really hard to work out the math here. So Sephora, many folks may know there's quite a lot of Sephora locations within Kohl's, and we'll actually be talking to the head of North America for Sephora in an episode coming up in a couple of weeks, so more on that. But anyway, Sephora's sales were up 15%. Now, a lot of that was driven by 140 new locations opening year over year, but 9% comp. So if you think about all of Kohl's being down 9%, but Sephora being up 9%, just think of how bad the rest of that store is doing. Anyway, and Sephora is generally accretive to margins, but the net income for Kohl's was down almost 70% year over year. They've got pretty significant negative cash flow, both from operations as well as because of the capital they're spending on their stores. And they've got a big debt payment coming up next year. So there's a lot of issues here. The stock's performance has been terrible. So just lots of bad metrics. Now, the other big piece of news is that their CEO, Tom Kingsbury, who's been at the helm for a couple of years, he's stepping down. He's being replaced by Ashley Buchanan, who's a Dallas resident. He's also got a great pedigree, having not only been at Michael's for a number of years and doing a pretty solid job, but he's been in a number of other retailers like Walmart. But he's certainly got his hands full. Now, Kingsbury, I guess to his credit, you could say on the way out, did do a mea culpa, said there were a number of mistakes that he made in terms of scaling back their private label, basically getting out of the fine jewelry business to make way for Sephora, not keeping petite sizes and those kinds of things. But, you know, as I've said many times, not just about Kohl's, if you've got bad execution, engage in some own goals, as well as have a pretty crappy business model, you know, that's not a very good combination. So Ashley comes in with a lot to deal with, not only to address these execution issues and product mix and customer experience. There's a need to shore up the balance sheet. So are we looking at store closings? Are we looking at, maybe a investor group coming in for a buyout or a merger or something? So a lot's got to happen. And I expect Ashley's not going to sleep on taking some aggressive actions. So that'll be something to see in the new year. The other thing I was just thinking about is with all these Sephoras now at Kohl's, is something else going to happen there? Because if there start to be a lot of store closings or just the overall traffic is not a good situation, will Sephora start to get more aggressive about opening? I mean, they're already opening quite a few of their own locations, but wouldn't be too. I can tell you from some of the locations that the locations of Kohl's here in the DFW area, it wouldn't be terribly hard for Sephora to move across the street with their own location.
Can we talk about leadership and intent for a bit? I mean, Ashley, in my mind, Ashley Buchanan, he's not exactly a workout guy or a turnaround. I mean, these are awful numbers. Like, there's a lot of big, tough slogging to be done, store closures and all this stuff. Like, it's a tough job, right? Why, as a leader stepping into a role like that, he transformed Michael's not from downsizing, but from vision. It feels like there's a lot more than vision needed to turn this around. What do you think?
Well, personally, I think this is almost an impossible job. So good luck to him, as has nothing to do with his skills. But it's kind of the same way I feel about Mark Rosen at JCPenney. I have every reason to believe both Mark and Ashley are very skilled executives. But in many cases, it's an impossible situation. So, the thing that Kohl's has, I think, to their advantage compared to I always talk about the collapse of the unremarkable middle and obviously the challenges in mall-based department stores. In theory, Kohl's has the advantage of being off the mall, of being in more kind of neighborhood-ish locations to go head-to-head with a TJ Maxx and so forth. And you'd like to think that having, one of the, which, maybe is a topic for another day to go into in depth, but one of the shortcomings of off-price retail is they don't have nearly the reliable assortment. They don't have the structure of merchandise that's always going to be there. It's much more of a treasure hunt. So you'd think for people that, go to TJ Maxx and can't find what they want at a good price, that a value department store would actually be pretty well positioned. But that's obviously not been the case when you look at the numbers. So I do think there's some good things to work with in terms of the real estate strategy, single level, central cashiering, those kinds of things that are often seen as barriers for the Macy's and the JCPenney's of the world on the mall. But there's what's the differentiation factor at Kohl's right now? There really isn't anything that's compelling. So yeah, it's going to be a slog, I think, to try to get them onto a path of growth.
Well, all right, we're going to try something different for this episode. We're going to take a break from the news, presented, of course, by our friends at Scale, and get to part one of our two-part interview with Lauren and Chantal. We'll be back with more retail news, including JCPenney, thoughts on Target's week results and what that might mean, and thoughts on the excellent results from Abercrombie, plus new moves in AI from Amazon.
Well, I've been looking forward to this interview for quite some time. We've got the two authors of a fabulous new book, Selling Sexy, Victoria's Secret and the Unraveling of an American Icon. Lauren and Chantal, welcome. Thanks for joining us on the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. This is so fun.
Really, when I was reading through your book, there's so many great stories, so much really excellent history. I mean, beyond the Victoria's Secret story itself, which we're going to dig into, there's just a lot about the evolution of retail. So if folks want a real primer on how retail has evolved, it's a great resource as well. And we might touch on some of that. But anyway, before we jump into your great new book, maybe each of you could just tell us a bit about your personal and professional journey. I've known you guys separate from the book for a little bit, but how did you get to where you are, and how did you come to work on this project together? Maybe Chantal, you can start us off on that question.
Sure. Lauren and I worked together for many years at the Business of Fashion, which is where I first, I think, met you, Steve, and spoke about many different topics over the years for different stories. And it was a really fantastic experience there, right? Like diving into the business side of the industry and working for such a fun and dynamic trade publication. And part of that, we were covering Victoria's Secret as it was having some really unusual challenges in 2018, 2019, 2020. And Lauren and I had different conversations over the years about books that we wanted to do, not necessarily together, but just our ambitions about, finding a story that made sense for a book format that really spoke to people and spoke to this moment in the fashion industry and American retail. And, I was speaking to a source of ours who had a really interesting perspective on Victoria's Secret. And I called Lauren and said, you should really do a book about this company. It's so much more complicated and fascinating than people realize. And she said, why don't we do it together? And that sort of launched us down this really interesting journey. We spent, I think, 3+ years speaking to executives from all these different eras of the business, met these really fascinating people, learned so much about retail in this country since really the post-war period, and how much it's transformed, and how Victoria's Secret came to be such an influential and polarizing brand that we all know, whether we like it or not.
Right.
Yeah. And now, a lot has changed since then. Lauren and I both have different jobs. I work at The Cut at New York Magazine. She has a fantastic newsletter at Puck and a podcast. So a lot has changed, but this project was really fun to work on.
So Lauren, tell us a little bit about your background. And I guess Chantal touched on this a little bit, but why did you feel compelled to jump on this particular topic?
Yeah, so I've been covering the fashion industry since essentially almost 20 years now, since the end of 2005. I was a reporter at Forbes, which, Steve, I have a feeling that's where I first reached out to you. So I've been writing about Saks Fifth Avenue,
right,
for almost longer than I've been alive. But have been a sort of general interest business reporter whose expertise is the fashion industry. So I write about the high low. I always say my coverage ranges from Target to Hermes. And I've always just been interested in smart businesses, good brands, and the sagas that end up playing out with these different companies. And every place I've worked, essentially, I've covered that stuff. I've dipped in and out, like Chantal, out of consumer and business and trade. And we met previous to Business of Fashion, but we worked together at Business of Fashion for a long time, where I was full-time for 7 years and a frequent contributor for 10. So when they first started out. And I've always wanted to write a book. I've always felt like, I'm a news reporter. I'm a beat reporter. I'm not, writing a book is a big undertaking that requires a kind of discipline that I think most news reporters don't have. You're so used to, you get the story out and it's over and you start the next one and you sort of let things go very easily. Whereas a book requires like a lot of in-depth research and reporting, and also, the writing cadence is different. You're not filing every single day. Looking back, I probably should have been writing every day and not just doing big chunks. But I always wanted to do it, but I also always wanted to do something that would appeal to people beyond the industry. A lot of the work I've done has been really focused on people inside fashion. And at Puck, I'm really lucky because of the way we're set up. I do have a ton of industry insiders following me, and CEOs and designers, all of that stuff. But I also there's crossover with the other authors. So I get emails from, public policy people in DC and costume designers and casting directors in Hollywood and studio execs and just, finance guys, like a real cross. But before that, I was really writing to the industry, and I wanted to do something that like my friends from high school would be interested in as much as the people who read Business of Fashion. And there just aren't a lot of fashion brands that sort of fit that bill. Fashion is such a big part of popular culture, but it really, I'd say in the last 10 years has really become pop culture. Before, fashion brands were sort of, it was more of a pursuit and less a part of life. I think that's changed, and youth culture has taken fashion as its own. But when Chantal mentioned Victoria's Secret, we had always sort of batted ideas around, and she mentioned it as a book. I primarily cover the luxury industry, but there are, as I said, like a few of these more mass brands, Gap, Target, Abercrombie and Fitch, Victoria's Secret, that I've always tracked because I'm interested in them as brands, and it doesn't really matter the price point. And it just felt like we had done some really interesting reporting around the Limited Brands Group, or L Brands as it was known at that time, and Les Wexner and what he built. And when we started thinking about this, it was 2020, and we were still in the midst of this idea that like the mall was totally dead, even though we all knew it wasn't. At least the B and C malls felt really dead, and they still do to an extent, but everything has morphed. And I was always interested in, like, this guy created the mall. He created this town, New Albany, but also built up Columbus, Ohio, and Ohio overall around the idea that people shop at a mall. And so, like, what happens when those malls go away? And so I just felt like it was a great way to tell the story of American entrepreneurship, American retail, and American culture, because, like, as we've said on this grand tour, American culture is consumer culture is American culture. So it just felt like if we were going to spend all this time and invest all this time, it should be something really big, and Victoria's Secret was it. And we got really lucky. The book came out, I think, a week before they relaunched the fashion shows. So there was also, it was in the water when we launched in October. We just got, that was not, they knew our book was coming out long before they set that date. So, it was, really lucky for us.
Based on the book, we get a bit of luck, and the harder you work, the luckier you get, is the way it sounds to me. Chantal, let's pick up on a couple of those themes. Now, this our pod's not a history lesson, but one of the things I really appreciated about the book was that it did, basically outline, as Lauren's been saying, that the relative history and the importance of retail and how it's evolved. So Lauren's done an amazing job of just kind of capturing that just now. But let's talk about how VS Victoria's Secret became part of the Limited, and a little bit of its origin story that people may not know.
Yeah, Victoria's Secret was started by a couple, Roy and Gay Raymond, who were living at the time in the Bay Area. And Roy had already started his first business. He would prove to be a sort of a serial entrepreneur, someone always thinking about white spaces and an interesting opportunity, and someone with a real vision for building a world through businesses, whether it's through catalogs or through stores. And the first business that he started, with his wife's help, with Gay's help, was a sex toy catalog, which was a great idea, a way to sort of bring those products discreetly to people. And it was quite successful. It was called Xandria. And then coming out of that, he had a similar idea to tackle another taboo-esque category, women's lingerie, which he felt was sort of trapped between the dreary department store and kind of these very upscale boutiques that were a little intimidating to enter. So Victoria's Secret started as both a catalog and a store, and it was more approachable, but still quite more high end than what we think of the company today, kind of like a mini department store with European labels, but a lot of care and attention into sort of the presentation, the design of the stores. It was Victoria because it was sort of Victorian-esque antique furniture, silks and luscious textures, rugs, curtains, that kind of thing. So the store was, grew to about 6 in the Bay Area, and it was gaining a reputation and a following, but Roy was not able to sort of run the business and needed a bailout. He was sort of on the verge of bankruptcy by the time Wexner came into his life, and Les at that time was, already a revolutionary in the retail business, and he had built this chain, The Limited, out of Columbus, out of nothing, and become one of the most successful retail executives in the country. And was, instead of cashing out as a lot of people expected him to do, he went on an acquisition spree, bought Lane Bryant, and he came across Victoria's Secret and got a great deal on it, about $1 million in stock, because Roy didn't have a lot of options, and he saw an opportunity to expand that chain and to really profit off of it, which is what he did. So yeah, by the summer of 1982, that Victoria's Secret became part of what was then still called The Limited as a corporation, and later was better known as L Brands. And at that point,
do you think he was looking for that line of product? I mean, 6 stores would be hard to grab anybody's attention. Or did he just literally trip over? I mean, sometimes it's just you just fall in and say, maybe we should get into this category. Or was it a little more deliberate than that?
He claims there was an interview, right, Chantal, a video interview where he sort of acts like it was his idea. I think
that he was thinking about that category was ripe for disruption. Yeah.
And the way that he operates is he always employed a lot of scouts, and his merchandisers and his executives were also scouting all the time. So they would scout for trends, but they were also scouting for business opportunities. And I think he liked the idea and the concept around how they were approaching this category, and he could see how to scale it quickly and just make everything cheaper and make everything easier to access. And so he could the interesting thing about Les Wexner is his personal taste did not sort of play into the decisions he made, but he could spot good taste, or he could spot like a good idea, and he would take that and replicate it and make a lot of money off of it. But the idea itself was never his own. We talked to executives who he sort of sent out to look at the stores in San Francisco and get their take and everything. It was just sort of how he operated.
Interesting. Quick question, Chantal. Like, it's one thing to take a store, scale it, all very impressive, right? Open a bunch of stores. But it's another thing to become this cultural zeitgeist. Was it the right thing at the right time? Or was it more deliberate? I mean, it became, in the book chronicles very well the role it plays in culture. But was it just circumstance or happenstance or or the genius of Lex Wexner?
Well, I think it was a combination of all those things. It didn't necessarily have to become the cultural force that it was. I think that shift really started to happen in the mid-90s after Wexner and his executives had already scaled Victoria's Secret to most of the major malls across the country. There was sort of a turning point that they talk about, which was the arrival of the Wonder Bra, a really popular push-up bra that Victoria's Secret did not sell. And there was a ton of buzz and anticipation around it, women running to stores to buy it. It was like a big trend that they missed out on. And I think at that moment they realized they needed to put more strategy and investment behind advertising and speak to a wider audience to turn this brand into something bigger than just sort of the lingerie chain at your mall. And that's when they started doing fashion shows. That's when the Angels factored in. They started doing national television commercials. Wexner for decades had been anti-advertising because he had that captive audience at the mall that he knew was going to walk by his stores. So, we spoke to an executive who described the marketing division when she arrived there in the mid-90s as just a sign shop. There wasn't much else that they felt they needed to do. It had worked really well for them. And that really shifted in the 90s. So by the early 2000s, Victoria's Secret had become this sort of symbol of American beauty, American femininity, and became sort of larger even than the business itself and helped propel this business as sort of a singular force in the market with no significant competitors that could claim that kind of cultural influence in the same way.
So I wonder, just kind of going a little bit further on that, I mean, one of the things that you guys do such a great job of getting into is the evolution of the brand. And I guess I didn't appreciate, perhaps because of the sort of products that I wear, the significance of the Wonder Bra coming into play. But that did set the stage for the Angels, for the fashion shows, and for this idea of the selling sexy, the title of your book, right? How did that all come about? And was it just a series of coincidences that kind of set them on that path, or was there more intention behind it?
There was definitely intention. I think Wexner's organization was all about scaling and growth. They would have this Monday night meeting that I know other organizations have. It feels like such a signature Wexner thing where they were thinking about how can we increase the business this week. There was such a relentless focus on scaling. So they weren't satisfied, with the growth that they'd had by the early to mid 90s. They wanted to really dominate this space. So they were always testing different strategies to get there. And I think they got so big that at some point they had to think, look at national advertising and think about, by that point, the catalog and the stores were still run largely separately, and they started to unify those two distribution channels and start selling more of the same items and have a more unified strategy there in terms of marketing and all of those things. So they were constantly thinking about how to push this business forward. And that's how, one of the things that we really enjoyed researching in this book is like Victoria's Secret's role as sort of a media company, in a way that we find really common now, where brands release magazines or have cast of characters with their spokespeople. The Victoria's Secret was doing that decades ago, and it was something that they developed and tested by, just by pushing themselves to keep this brand growing and push against competitors, which was primarily department stores, but that was a huge competitor.
All right, we're back with the retail news of the week. A reminder to tune in Friday for the second part of our interview with Lauren and Chantal, where we'll talk about the culture phenomena that Victoria's Secret became, and then the challenging years to follow and lessons learned for retailers. Steve, you mentioned JCPenney there a couple of times. I guess we haven't heard from them, but we're hear from them probably at the end of December. Any expectations from Mark Rosen and team?
It's hard for me to imagine their numbers aren't going to be poor. I would expect at least down in the mid-single digits, just based upon some of the information we have about traffic and just the trend they've been on and what we see with department stores overall. Yeah, they don't, because they're not a publicly traded company, they don't report in the same way, but we typically get some insight into their numbers a few weeks after their competitors report. So yeah, that would seem to be late December.
Any more thoughts on Target's recent result? I mean, their numbers were so challenged that a lot of people have spent a fair bit of time kind of pulling that apart and saying where did the wheels come off and what's the future for Target?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a little bit more because, as you point out, folks have been commenting on it. And one of the things I think that's kind of interesting is this question of whether, and our friends Chris and Ann at OmniTalk were talking about this, and they're both former Target executives. And one of the things they were talking about was, did we as an industry lose sight of how much Target benefited from the COVID years where, first, during the first several weeks, several months, when Target was one of the few retailers that were able to stay open as an essential retailer, so they got a lot of sales. Then as we started to recover from COVID, there was still kind of this one-stop shopping phenomenon that was going on. And so, did that look like they were really performing well, or did it sort of mask some bigger issues? The other thing, which we talked about as a good thing, and of course we had an executive from Target on the podcast a couple of years ago, is they did spend a lot of their time really developing this hybrid fulfillment model to be able to deliver from stores, pick up in stores. And that, I think, has served them well. But it seems like it took their eye off the ball in terms of executing at stores. So, the other thing is that, as we talked about, I think a few months back, Target's announced they're planning to open quite a lot of stores. And with their performance, you have to wonder whether they're going to continue with that. Just one quick thing in the spirit of Black Friday, just to mention, which should be good for this quarter, is Taylor Swift's Eras Tour book is being released exclusively at Target. So I imagine that'll drive some nice traffic and some nice incremental sales. So no teardrops on Target's guitar from that partnership. I don't think that'll be enough for them to kind of save the quarter and give them good momentum going into 2025. So I don't know, you got to think Brian Cornell, I think we talked about this last week, you got to think he may not survive this.
Yeah, he's got to be feeling the heat. Taylor Swift just left Toronto, actually, for a 6-day run, heading to Vancouver. What a phenomenon she was here. I mean, I was talking to somebody about they did the calculation about how much net improvement in the Toronto economy from one artist. It's just incredible. So, congratulations to her. She wraps up the entire tour. What's it been going on for like 8-9 years now, I think. She wraps up that.
Slight exaggeration, but yes, it is. She is her own economy. I think she has her own gravitational pull as well.
I think so. She wraps that up in Vancouver for another 6-day run. So let's wrap on some positive news. And when I think of positive news, Abercrombie keeps its remarkable retail record going in their results. Talk about it.
Well, it's crazy. I mean, this has been, and good for them. It just shows that even in actually, we talked about last week how challenging the apparel environment has been overall, but that doesn't seem to have stopped Abercrombie and Fitch. Their total sales were up 14%. Their net income, which is already good margin performance the last few years, their net income was up almost 40%. If you drill down into their two major nameplates, the Abercrombie brand up 15%, the Hollister brand up almost 14%. So yeah, they just keep rolling. I did, because I love some of these comparisons just to put them in context.
I know you love this.
But the market capitalization for Abercrombie is nearing $8 billion, which is more than Macy's and Kohl's combined. So you think about, these big stores, with all this revenue, aren't remotely close in terms of their stock market value. The other thing, if you had bought Abercrombie and Fitch 5 years ago, you would have made 8 times your money. So that's not too bad. It's not quite NVIDIA numbers, but still pretty darn good. And the stock is up 63% this year on top of several years of really great performance. So yes, quite remarkable, which shows if you really know your customer, you really go deep on bringing them what they need, and you execute well, you can grow even in a down or mostly flat market.
Well, you mentioned NVIDIA, so I just got a note from the podcast Bureau of Standards, and apparently we have to talk about AI in every episode now. So let's fulfill that with Amazon investing more in Anthropic, and Perplexity's got some interesting things going on. Hit the highlights.
Two really quick things. Well, so we've talked about this, and many people may know that Anthropic, the AI company, which is basically Amazon's AI engine, has gotten quite a lot of investment from Amazon. Well, they got another $4 billion in investment, which both, I guess, speaks to how much money is necessary to really build out these large language models and all the
right. Like, where does that money go? Oh my God! It's like you got to build their own nuclear plant or something. Like, where does $4 billion go?
It's extraordinary, because certainly we've seen other companies, Microsoft, et cetera, investing quite a lot of money in this space. Yeah. So Amazon obviously doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on AI for both their AWS business as well as the rest of Amazon. The other thing, and this is a story, I meant to include it last week, AI search engine Perplexity, which is a fast-growing search engine with a lot of natural language search, those kinds of things. They announced a shopping feature for the professional users, which allows folks, and this is just in the US right now, to shop within the app. And there's a lot of sense that these AI kind of agents will be the next wave of online shopping. So this is new, but I think something for people really to keep their eyes on. It's at least innovative in the short term. Of course, a lot of companies, Google, et cetera, working in this space. But I definitely think it's something to experiment with. Download the app as well as see what they're up to.
Well, what a busy week. Retail results, tariff talk, and the Cyber 5 are now in the rearview mirror. Let's leave it there. Thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Season 9 will be available each and every Tuesday, so be sure and tell your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us. If you liked our episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts.
And I'm Steve Dennis, strategic advisor, keynote speaker, and best-selling author of 2 books, Leaders Leap, Transforming Your Company at the Speed of Disruption, and Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant and advisor, keynote speaker, and media entrepreneur. You can learn more about me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.